Wow, there are a lot of you. Hi. Those are my students back there. WSU Everett, go Everett. Thank you for joining us. We are so happy to have you all here today to share in the 43rd Murrow Symposium Lifetime Achievement Awards ceremony. What a privilege it is. What a privilege it is to be here with all of you as we celebrate the Murrow legacy. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication and the 43rd anniversary of the Murrow Symposium. And it is the collaborative effort of the Symposium Committee, our sponsors, the speakers, students, staff, and our community that makes this event successful. Now, a little housekeeping. I have to remind you that there is no flash photography tonight. And we also ask that you silence your cell phones, but we understand as communication professionals, our phones might be silent, our thumbs are still very active. So for the next few minutes, feel free to check in, live tweet, post as necessary, and when you do, please use #Symposium43. And then your name also will be up on the screen, okay? As the keynote speech begins, we just ask that you put your cell phones away until after the event is over. And that's just in deference to our speaker and other attendees. Please help me give a very warm welcome to, excuse me, I forgot one piece of housekeeping. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end. Has anybody received an index card? Anybody who's received a card, if you would like to ask Mr. Siegel a question, please write your question down on the card, and we will come around and collect them right before the Q&A session today. And we will have your questions answered. So please help me now give a warm welcome to Murrow College's new permanent dean, our very own Bruce Pinkleton.
Well, good evening. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's my honor to be here this evening, and thanks to each of you who have joined us. This is an exciting evening for the Murrow College, and I'm grateful to the sponsors who have made it possible. Our presenting sponsor is Alaska Airlines. Our crimson sponsor is Chateau Saint-Michel and Washington State University Marketing and Communications. And we extend special thanks also to Tim and Karen Pavish and Annika Wrvr for their generous support of the symposium. We also want to recognize all those who contribute through Cougs Give and other fundraising activities. Cougs Give is tomorrow, by the way, so you have a great opportunity to have an impact on the college. You're part of our Dean Circle, and we thank you very much for your support. With your help, we are here to serve students to better prepare them to succeed in their careers and in life, and we appreciate your generosity. We also are grateful to Northwest Public Broadcasting, the students of Cable 8 Production, the Association of Women in Communications, and the students of the J. Rocky Public Relations Student Society of America. And Murrow College staff and faculty whose contributions really have helped to shape the symposium have been critically important. I need to give a special thank you to my staff, headed by Dina Penton, who's done an outstanding job, and our development team, headed by Carol Kowalski, also has done an outstanding job. And a very, very special thank you to Corey Wilder, without whose incredible work this would not be possible. How about a round of applause? All right. As many of you know, the Murrow College family lost a legend recently with the passing of Keith Jackson. While Keith's professional accomplishments are too numerous to mention here, it's instructive that he received an Edward R. Murrow Award for being the top senior in his graduating class of 1954, and 45 years later received a Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award from what was then the Murrow School of Communication. And in between those awards, he made sportscasting history by broadcasting from the Soviet Union, was named Sportscaster of the Year 5 consecutive times, was inducted into 3 Halls of Fame, including the Rose Bowl Hall of Fame, received the highest honor awarded by the National Football Foundation, and also the Amos Alonzo Stagg Award from the American Football Coaches Association. Please join me in watching this video tribute to Keith Jackson, and a special thank you to Eric Johnson for creating this wonderful tribute and for sharing it with all of us today.
It's 1938 on a farm in eastern Georgia. A boy with a pet mule listens to sports on the radio.
Right to the body, a left hook, a right to the head, a left to the head.
It's a music that he will dance to for the rest of his life. He imitates what he hears, but there are ears in the cornfields.
My grandmother said to my mother, you better go out there and talk to your kid. I think he's crazy because he's running around in the cornfield talking to himself. And I was not talking to myself. I was sending Walter Mitty over the goal line at the Rose Bowl.
It's 1950. After a stint in the Marines, he enrolls at Washington State under the GI Bill. In the long shadow of Murrow, he begins painting his own legend. And more than 60 years later, we talk about him here still. You can find your voice in Pullman, and so it was for a crew-cut kid with pipes like rolling thunder and dreams bigger than the Palouse itself. Like so many who would follow, he cut his teeth at KUGR radio. He roamed the same hills and cracked books in the same buildings that we all did.
Your Cougar roots are still very strong, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was only 48 students when I went there. It was a good experience. Freshman class president, and I drove the garbage truck some days for walking around money.
He got a paying gig doing radio in Lewiston, Idaho.
In those days, Hardwick, we did Western request programs. And Hardwick was called Snake River Sam, and I was Clearwater Clint. And I mean, we had fun.
It's 1954. He takes a job in Seattle at 4th and Denny. Como Television, the little station that could.
Line close-up with 3 outstanding picture stories still to come here on Channel 4, but right now...
He was with us for a decade. He was on the streets, he anchored the news, and of course he banged out copy and delivered the sports.
This is Keith Jackson speaking from the official barge here at Lake Chelan as we approach the 12:30 starting time for the first unlimited race in the nation.
The Cougar did Husky football games for a time.
4th down. They don't make it here, they got to give up the football. Hively throws, hits Makita, first down, gets away, still going. It's a touchdown, it's a touchdown, it's a touchdown. Holy mackerel, Makita on the sideline, got away from Dave Grayson and went in standing up. Woo-wee!
It was also in '58 that he returned to Pullman to call a Cougar game against Stanford.
The house is almost full here this afternoon, and in the background you hear the Washington State College Band playing the Cougar fight song.
In 1964, he left Channel 4 for the big time. At the network, he spanned the globe to bring us the constant variety of sport.
Hello again, everybody. I'm Keith Jackson.
He was fearless. You had to be to work with Cosell.
Our play-by-play announcer, Keith Jackson.
Or go toe-to-toe with Castro. And he did it all. All of it. Race car driving.
Oh, we've got an ass, Levi!
Track and field.
You gotta have some fight in your soul.
The Olympics, both summer and winter.
Rick Martin has the lead.
One of the things that I'm most proud of is that I called the 2 greatest gold medal winners in the history of the Olympic Games.
Mark Spitz has 7 gold medals.
He did baseball, too.
Long drive right field. It is goodbye.
And when you are fearless, you tackle even the most dangerous of games.
I'm Keith Jackson. I'll admit, I've got one of the tougher assignments of my career today.
But he is and always will be the voice of college football. It was the job he was born to do. And even in the old days, you didn't big-time Keith Jackson, and you didn't keep him waiting. Not even if your name was Bear Bryant.
Stood there and waited, and he's chewing the fat, taking his time, 45 minutes. I told the guys, button her up, boys, we're going home. Oh, you can't do the interview. No, we're not. We packed up our gear and we were walking across the field on the way out. And he stepped out from the little crowd and he said, did you want to see me? And I said, not anymore, Coach. We'll try to catch you next time. Just kept right on going.
He was on the road longer than the Stones. Only he wasn't rock and roll. He was more like a good country song. Comfortable, knowing, elegantly simple, with a hell of a story.
We've had all the romance. Now let's find out if she can dance.
Amplify, clarify, punctuate, and stay the hell out of the way.
He never dominated the flow of a game, but moved with it, around it. A football bard with the eye of a poet and the timing of a dancer.
It is incomplete. He didn't hold it.
He retired in '98, and it wasn't the same. And then he gave us a few more years, generous. Through it all, there was a special connection to the place where it started. A once-in-a-lifetime talent, a one-of-a-kind corner of the world. Him a part of it a part of him.
Hello, I'm Keith Jackson. You know, when we get old enough to look back and reflect upon our experiences and achievements, I guess most of us can recall a special teacher, a coach, a particular class in school, or a place where we've lived that left a lasting impression on us. All these kind of things come tumbling back through the mind and memory when we recall our years at WSU.
Somehow the marriage of this folksy, honest young man and this folksy and honest place created a broadcast legend.
When you're looking ahead every day, your whole life goes pretty fast. And you look back at it and say, whoa.
Have the game of your life.
The games go on without him. Football is still football, but it was better with Keith Jackson. And to this day, when we truly love the game, its adrenaline and ferocity and grace, we talk about him still.
A living legend, or no longer an important part of the Murrow family for many, many years. And if you go to the Murrow complex, you'll see the Jackson building, the Keith Jackson newsroom. We have graduate fellowships named after Keith Jackson. His imprint is all over our college, and we're especially proud of his association with WSU. Edward R. Murrow graduated from Washington State University in 1930 and did much of his important work as a journalist in the 1940s, 50s, and early 1960s. In an age when social and digital media have transformed how we communicate and consume news, the natural presumption would be that Murrow's principles and work, while outstanding for their time, are largely irrelevant today. Instead, we find ourselves at a time when Murrow's words are as relevant as the day he first spoke them. When Murrow said, "To be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. To be credible, we must be truthful, or that a nation of sheep will beget a government of wolves." He might as well have been speaking about news and events in 2017 or 2018. With campuses in Pullman, Everett, and Vancouver, faculty in the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University aspire to teach students the ethical courage, innovation, and professional excellence embodied by Edward R. Murrow as they prepare to work in the evolving fields of journalism and communication. His example reminds us to rely on facts instead of fears, to question without reproach, to listen as well as we speak, and to seek and tell the truth always. In a real sense, our mission in the Murrow College is to teach and inspire students in keeping with the legacy of Edward R. Murrow, and we do that tonight by honoring Robert Siegel with a Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. Here to present the award to Mr. Siegel is WSU's 11th president, Kirk Schultz. President Schultz is capably directing WSU's advancement into one of the nation's top 25 public research universities, one that offers graduate and undergraduate students an innovative and transformative educational experience. President Schultz.
I love having music, so when I drink my water, it just feels so much better. In its role as a fourth estate, journalism serves as a critical role in the health of free societies by monitoring and tempering the influence of those in power. By serving as observers to those in government and other organizations and holding them accountable for their actions and outcomes, journalists contribute to the free flow of truthful information free societies require. For decades, Murrow College faculty have recognized and honored the achievements of journalism and communication at its Murrow Symposium. Murrow Award honorees have a demonstrated commitment to the ethical standards, courage, and professional excellence exemplified by Edward R. Murrow as he reported from Buchenwald during World War II, challenged the abuses of power by Senator Joseph McCarthy, or reported on the plight of migratory farm workers in Harvest of Shame. Tonight, we honor a journalist who personifies Murrow's ethical courage and commitment to seeking and telling unembellished truth by presenting Robert Siegel with the 2018 Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. From across our country and around the globe, Mr. Siegel has covered the most pressing issues of our time. He began his work at NPR in 1976 and established NPR's first overseas reporting bureau in London in 1979. In more than 40 years in national public radio, he has reported on wide-ranging topics in a welcoming voice that inspires confidence and trust. Who can forget, for example, his reporting with Melissa Block from China's Sichuan province when it was devastated by a magnitude 7.8 earthquake in 2008. The poignant news reports received worldwide attention. They were at times distressing. They were also moving, promising, hopeful. Mr. Siegel's consistent accuracy and commitment to the truth have resulted in numerous awards for his reporting, too many to mention here. They include the National Press Foundation Kiplinger Award for Distinguished Contributions to Journalism and multiple Alfred DuPont Columbia University Awards he received either singly or as part of a team. As a leader at NPR and a longtime host of All Things Considered, Mr. Siegel has contributed eloquently and articulately to our national discourse on the many of the most important and polarizing issues we face. He has done so without patronization or vitriol, seeking the unvarnished truth as he has contributed to our national conversation on issues of critical importance to our country and world. Perhaps lesser known, Mr. Siegel has a deep appreciation for classical music, a terrific sense of humor, and has landed the most coveted appreciation of all, a cameo appearance on The Simpsons and his own category on Jeopardy! Please join me in watching this video tribute.
For millions of Americans, he was the voice of NPR.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Robert Siegel.
Robert grew up in New York and was shaped by his parents, who were school teachers. They made sure he spoke correctly, read, and did all the proper things.
I just imagine that Robert displayed those qualities because he was born that way. I imagine a small child walking around his New York City apartment, torturing his parents with deep thoughts and very meaningful questions.
When I was there in the early days, they had a need. They needed somebody to read the news. Well, I knew that Robert was at WRVR, which was a radio station that was a few blocks from Columbia College.
And he brought me an air check of this guy, and I listened to it. And I said to him, I don't think so at all. Very New York, very nasal. I wouldn't hire him. The tape was Robert Siegel.
First the news and Bob Siegel.
World leaders marked this Christmas Day with public messages and private gatherings. President Ford and his family.
Our program is directed by Marika Partridge, edited by Melissa Block, and produced by Michael Sullivan.
For National Public Radio, I'm Robert Siegel in London.
In the north of Moscow,
in West Berlin, this is Robert Siegel.
Atop the levee at Hannibal, Missouri. This is Robert Siegel, NPR News in Chengdu, China.
I'm on the Avenue Habib Bourguiba, which is the main drag of
He's done everything, and that's because we trust him. And I think the listeners trust him.
Never forget what he did around 9/11. He found himself in New York. And of course, a newsman that he is, he headed right down to the World Trade Center.
Nature ordained a blue, cloudless sky for New York today. But as you walk south toward the World Trade Center site, you have to look back uptown to remember the impeccable weather.
He has standards, and he cares about standards, journalistic standards, grammatical standards, all language standards, and he insists that people live up to them. And he has a hissy fit about that. But I'm with him on those hissy fits. They matter.
All Things Considered is a program, not
a show.
It's pronounced entrepreneur, not entrepreneur.
It's Grand Central Terminal, not Grand Central Station.
I'll give you 4 words about Robert. Brilliant.
Visionary.
Curious.
Brilliant.
Wise.
Stalwart.
Brilliant.
Demanding.
Brilliant.
Robert is smarter than all of us.
It's rare to meet a really, really sweet person. And he's had that all his life.
Robert Siegel is one of the greatest journalists of our generation. Congratulations, Robert, on the Edward R. Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Broadcast Journalism.
I am not Robert Siegel. Anyway, that wasn't on the script. In recognition of his prolific career in journalism, we are honored to present Mr. Robert Siegel with the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. So will Bruce Pinkleton and Robert please join us up on the stage? Please, a big round of applause.
Thank you so much, President Schultz and Dean Pinkleton. Thank you for this award, which is it's a tremendous honor for anybody in my business to be connected, even remotely, to Edward R. Murrow, and it's greatly appreciated, and I'm very flattered. I also have watched enough sports in my time to be pretty honored by being mentioned on the same night as Keith Jackson, who is quite a presence in the world of sports journalism. Hi. For 31 years, I hosted All Things Considered. I worked there for 10 years before that, some of it in management. But for all those years that I hosted the program, we knew from what we heard from friends and family and people who stopped us when they heard our voices, and we knew from audience researchers that there were a couple of million people out there listening at any given moment. But we looked in the studio and we saw the director, we saw the engineer, maybe a producer. So it's always been a treat to actually get to see the people on the other end of the radio. As I've said for all these years, whenever I get to meet people who listen, I'm always struck by the fact that you don't look at all like what I thought you would look like. That, I actually thought you'd all be taller and have more hair than you do. I'm retired, but the joke isn't, evidently, and it goes on. I should say also that this honor has been granted to many people whom I admire tremendously, and also to some people whom I know or knew pretty well. Among them, my first field producer, I ever worked with Deb Amos, who went on to a great career as a correspondent in her own right. The late Dan Schorr, who was very close to me, and also Peter Jennings, whom I came to know pretty well when we were both in London at the same time. So I'm deeply honored by their company, by this association with them. Having recently retired in January, and that video was produced by my friends for the big retirement party that they sprung on me. Having retired, I feel, if not obliged, at least permitted to do some summing up about broadcast journalism as I've experienced it, what's different between then and now, and what I've learned from the changes. Then, for me, I think the most convenient then for me to start with is 50 years ago this spring, 1968, when I was a senior at Columbia College at Columbia University, where I had spent a tremendous amount of time that I should have spent studying at the college radio station, fooling around. I'd spent a little bit of that time not fooling around, learning to do newscasts and doing a little bit of reporting, usually about demonstrations on campus. And in the spring of 1968, in April, Columbia erupted into massive protests. Buildings were occupied. There were some counter-protests outside the buildings. Ultimately, police were called in to arrest. At the time, I believe it was the largest mass arrest in the history of New York City, over 700 people. The issues at Columbia were, on the one hand, very local concerns. Should Columbia remain part of a consortium of universities through which university scientists did defense research? And should Columbia University build a university gym in a public park in West Harlem adjacent to the campus? Those local issues were, of course, in 1968 stand-ins for national, if not global issues, the war in Vietnam, and the indifference many African Americans felt to their concerns when building was done near or in their their neighborhoods. At the radio station, as these buildings are filling up, we knew the issues, we knew the buildings. We had broadcast lines to some of them for concerts or religious services. We knew the protesters. They were our classmates, our roommates. I don't think any undergraduate actually knew the president of the university at that time. He was a pretty remote guy. But we knew deans, and we knew other peoples in the administration, and we knew faculty. And we decided that as the buildings began to fill up, that we would do live round-the-clock coverage, probably in the way that we imagined CBS News would do it, which was sort of the gold standard for broadcasting. We thought it would be a night or two. Turned out to last for the rest of the academic year, essentially. One night, a couple of nights after we began our coverage of these protests and what various people were saying and doing about them, the police were called in to evict the students. Some senior faculty members protested. The university withdrew the police, and then we were set for another week of this standstill, which was covered all over the country. During the brief period when the police were to be sent in, the university administration communicated to us, the kids who ran this station entirely on our own without any faculty supervision, but the station was licensed to the university's trustees. We were told it would be a good idea for us to sign off our FM radio station, which could be heard, we claimed, with a 50-mile radius around New York City, pretty close. But we could remain broadcasting on the little AM carrier current, it was called, radio station, which could only be heard in the dormitories of the campus. And in truth, given the repairs that the transmitters required, it could almost never be heard anywhere. And we felt we were being shut down. And we gathered together, and it was decided that since the trustees were indeed the licensees of the university, we couldn't very well defy them. This was technically their radio station, but we went on the air and announced what the university had asked of us, and under those circumstances, we declined to remain on the air at all. So we signed off. The phones lit up all over the campus. The administration withdrew the cops, and they no longer raised any objection to our coverage. We had won a little free broadcasting issue against the university administration. About a week into the protest, the police were called in for real, arresting over 700 people, in many instances with unjustified force, despite official claims of an orderly police operation. We reported what our reporters had seen, and it wasn't orderly. Now, we found ourselves contradicting the authorities, which was kind of an interesting lesson in journalism. Then came still more protests, more arrests, and we broadcast it all. I was the anchor and a co-producer of what we did, and in that role, I found myself extremely comfortable. I learned what was going on, what had happened, what was likely to happen next, with lots of conversations with people in the know. So my curiosity was slaked. I loved that part of it. I also liked the fact that we were being of service to people. Imagine your university, one day suddenly the buildings are occupied, there are no classes, you don't know whether police are going to come and throw people out of buildings, you don't know if you'll graduate because there are no courses being taught, and there we were sorting out fact from rumor and actually being of help to people in a very confusing and difficult time. And I liked this role. I was not an activist by temperament. Had I not been on the radio, I don't think I would have either protested or counter-protested. Many of my friends did protest. In fact, there was one One woman who sat in a building and was arrested and spent a night at the Tombs, they called it the old House of Detention in New York, and I didn't know her then, but we met a few years ago, and in June it'll be 45 years that we've been married, so she has a slightly different perspective on those events than I do, but she respects my attempt at being straight about it. This broadcast journalism thing that I was doing, I thought it was great. I was, here we're on this radio station that's all over New York City. FM radio is now the big thing. People are listening to it by 1968. They hadn't for decades before that. And instead of moping around figuring out what I would do next, here I was learning stuff. I was being of use to people. And it occurred to me 50 years ago this spring that if I could figure out how to make a career out of doing this thing that I was doing at that moment, then I would be a happy man. I come to you today a happy man. And on a couple of occasions, whether it was Poland in turmoil in 1981 or New York after 9/11, Berlin after the wall came down. On a couple of occasions, I found those moments that were exceptional, and when the rules all seemed to be broken, and people were trying to find their way through new facts, and journalists and being on the air just provided a vital service to people, and I felt very fulfilled being part of providing that service. So I made my life in radio. On a few occasions, it occurred to me that this radio thing perhaps had no future. In the 1960s, the big companies that had owned the radio networks and the big radio stations also owned television networks and television stations. That was the future. And even though nearly every American listened to the radio by the late 1960s, starting with this thing that I've described to young people as odd artifact of the post-war America, the clock radio, that you used to wake up hearing a radio station. We just assumed everyone would wake up hearing a radio station, and it was just a matter of getting them to listen to yours. People would drive to work, and they'd listen in the car, and they'd come home and make dinner and listen to the radio. Even though everyone was listening to the radio, and in my case, you'd listen deep into the night for baseball games during the civilized half of the year when people played baseball. But by the late 1960s, when I went into radio, it was already, nobody used the phrase yet, I don't think. It was the legacy medium. Television was where the action was. But I was just old enough to remember and connect with this statement that was always made in defense of radio. Listen to radio, the pictures are better. They're the pictures in your head. Unfortunately, the pay and the job prospects were better in television. So there were a couple of unsuccessful efforts I made to escape radio before I made this happy connection with NPR, which surprised me as much as anyone. My first effort to escape radio after a season in commercial suburban radio, doing newscasts and a call-in show, was to go back to Columbia for graduate school in journalism. There they were familiar with my work from the college station a couple of years earlier, well thought of. So I was admitted despite my pretty shabby grades, which had been the other side of my doing radio all those years instead of school. I somehow managed to spend a year there, complete most of my coursework, finish my master's essay, but never quite collect the master's degree, which I still don't have, although Columbia Journalism School has embraced me as an honored alum, and I welcome the embrace. I did get to study under Fred Friendly, whom you may be aware of. He'd been president of CBS News, and he had been Murrow's producer when they made See It Now and other programs. And I learned a lot from Friendly. I also learned how to shoot and edit 16-millimeter film, which is not the most useful job skill in the world today. But the man who taught us had been a film editor at CBS News, and he, in fact, was the man who had put together rather brilliantly Murrow's documentary on migrant farm workers, Harvest of Shame. And if you haven't had a chance to go back and look at it, which I did last year for some reason that I can't recall, I think to show a younger colleague what you could have seen on CBS in 1960 or whatever, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's visual, and there are silences in it that are that speak volumes. In short, I spent a year of journalism graduate school worshiping in the Church of Ed Murrow, New York City Archdiocese. My memories of that year feel germane right now, here in Pullman, which, as Murrow's son Casey wrote to me in an email last week, was where his father had made the great step from Washington State College, as it was then, to the National Student Association and to the great world beyond. This was a vitally important place, he told me, to his father and as well to his uncles. I thought it would be appropriate for me to talk about, I guess was the most famous program that Murrow made that's already been referred to by Dean Pinkleton, and that was his program about Senator Joseph McCarthy. When I first saw Murrow's See It Now program about Joseph McCarthy, I was a graduate student. It was 1969. I'm astonished to say that it was only 15 years earlier that it had first aired. At the time, it felt to me like it was from a different century, and 15 years to me now feels like such a short period of time. But the last time I watched it was last week, as I was thinking about coming here and talking a little bit about broadcast journalism. In recent years, of course, this program in which Murrow debunks the wild claims of people being communists that Joe McCarthy had been making, it became a cultural touchstone when George Clooney made the movie Good Night and Good Luck. As Clooney explained, I think he told this to me in an interview, in order to get the movie made, he had to act in it. That would attract money. If there would be George Clooney, he figured out at some point that he couldn't play Murrow, so he played Fred Friendly. And it was kind of odd to see my old professor played by George Clooney, who's actually a lot better looking than Fred Friendly was. So I went back to look at it to see what it says to me about television journalism, broadcast journalism then and now. First, some disclaimers, which I think are worth mentioning. First, Murrow's program in March of 1954, which did unmask McCarthy as a witch hunter, a guy who mixed lies and innuendo with the occasional fact, and accused people of being communist traitors. It strikes my eye. I'm tempted to say it looks like 1954 to me, or it's typical of something of that time, but it's actually typical of nothing. It's exceptional. It is an exceptionally courageous and bold piece of work. At the time, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Republican, had a lot of trouble bringing himself to criticize the Republican senator from Wisconsin, knowing how popular Joe McCarthy was. Joe McCarthy was had been riding high and had been at it for 4 years. CBS News was not alone in taking on McCarthy. We have the program to look at, and a movie was made about it, but the Washington Post reporter Murray Marder, for one, the year before, several months earlier, had gone out to Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. He'd done some real reporting, and he had debunked McCarthy's claims about communists at Fort Monmouth, which incidentally was the fort where my parents were married. It reminded me that broadcasting, even at its best, very often follows the lead of very good, tough newspaper reporting. Still does today, and it did then. So we shouldn't look at a great piece of television in isolation from other tough, smart journalism. Another disclaimer, Murrow's broadcast did embolden other senators to challenge Senator McCarthy, but it actually took a full year before McCarthy's final defeat before a Senate investigative committee, a Senate hearing that's probably one of the most famous hearing moments, the great Have You No Decency moment delivered to him by the Army's special counsel, Joseph Welch. So our nation's politics and the popularity of a leading figure did not turn on a dime. They didn't then, and as I find myself saying to my wife very often, they don't now. Big change, even with a political figure who's been unmasked, doesn't happen instantly. It's also worth noting that Murrow demonstrated that McCarthy's attacks on people for being communists were, in the instances that he very carefully presented and then debunked, those people had not been communists. They had not been spies of any sort. And I personally have always felt that the McCarthy era, as it was called when I was growing up, is mislabeled because there actually had been a lot of communists. They weren't spies, they weren't all agents of the Soviet Union, but they had belonged to the Communist Party and they'd believed in this. And many of them, at the hands of the FBI or House Committee or federal loyalty boards, lost their careers doing everything from being factory foremen to school teachers. So, in fact, the oddity of Joe McCarthy was that he was the most famous, popular, anti-communist crusader, but the only one who never actually found a communist. And indeed, the story of the See It Now, which is quite important, was, look, this guy's so reckless, he slanders innocent people. But in fact, one could have imagined a deeper critique of the era at that time, which said that some of the people who had actually belonged to the Communist Party perhaps shouldn't have had their rights violated too, and the notion that there hadn't been any was wrong. Anyway, Murrow's broadcast displayed several of McCarthy's fake claims, and then, as I say, it ticked them off one by one. And as a matter of presentation, what I found striking last week as I watched it was that Murrow, the journalist, spoke to his viewers, still spoke to me via YouTube 50 years later, more than that, 60 years later, with unapologetic seriousness and rigor. By rigor, I mean that Murrow told people at the start of his broadcast that this could be very controversial, there could be repercussions. He was going to adhere very closely to the script. The film clips were the documents that he presented. This is the idea of why we call these things documentaries, was presumably that documents were entered into evidence. The documents didn't include any people talking about Joe McCarthy. They were McCarthy in action, and a couple of people introducing McCarthy at an event. They weren't critical interviews with McCarthy that were part of the program. It was the guy this program was about and the journalist presenting the contrary evidence to what McCarthy had proposed. When I say he was unapologetically serious, I mean that he didn't ridicule McCarthy. He didn't play it for laughs or even for smug smiles. This was a very important matter, and one could imagine that somebody who had begun the evening or the half hour thinking neutrally or even positively about Senator McCarthy might have come away at the end of it thinking, well, I guess much of what I've been listening to really isn't true. When he cited McCarthy's use of a quotation from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Murrow responds with his citation of Julius Caesar. This was a literate presentation. I've been thinking about the ways in which much reporting today, and much discussion of the news today about, say, a major public figure who lies, exaggerates, misrepresents things, is presented on our airwaves. And it strikes me that things are very, very different today from what we saw then. First, today, much of what's presented in broadcasting is done through conversation, which is, by definition, spontaneous, no great dramatic pauses, few occasions to cite Shakespeare. When I grew up listening to radio news and watching television news in the 1950s and 60s, I don't remember reporters conversing very much. They declared, they declaimed, they recited, they announced, they spoke with great authority, and some would even refer to themselves as this reporter rather than say me. You know, this reporter became interested in radio when he was a student at Columbia. This is how people spoke in a very formal and stylized way. I think there was a turning point at the Democratic National Convention of 1968. I remember watching it, and especially on NBC, at the end of these furious days of arguments over platform planks on Vietnam War or segregation and arguments over seating a segregated delegation from the South or an integrated one, at the end of the day, the two anchormen, Chet Huntley and David Brinkley, seated in the skybox overlooking the floor, would just talk to their four exhausted guys who'd been covering the whole thing. And they conversed. They spoke informally, They expressed what they felt about what had happened at the convention, outside of which there are protests that are totally reminiscent of what I'd seen at Columbia a few months earlier. And I was impressed deeply by the clarity of thought of these men, who are all men, and by the spontaneity of their insights and their conversation. It was a rarity. These guys were human, and they were talking like very intelligent, interesting humans. Over the next few years, Washington Week on public television became a fairly popular show among people who were interested in the news. And once again, here were reporters sitting around a table, basically newspaper people or magazine people, some columnists, and they were speaking without the style book, but with authenticity, often with emotion, and with real differences of opinion about the alarming events of the day during the presidency of Richard Nixon. Journalists, especially when they appeared as broadcasters, had become much more human. We live in a time that values authenticity, and the formality of an older style of address was so formal and so stylized that it strikes us, or struck us then, as inauthentic. As a young guy getting involved in this, I was all for this huge change, for making the presentation of the news more conversational and more human. And with much change, I think now, with hindsight, that perhaps this one overshot the mark. To stand a proverb on its head, perhaps to be too human is to err. In the umpteen conversations that unfold across national broadcast news media these days, especially but not only on cable, the lines of clarity and responsibility are routinely crossed, and I think it could do with some formality. Anchors ask questions that come dripping with assumptions and implied opinions. There are reporters who work for the channel you're watching or the network, and whose findings presumably bear the editorial stamp of approval of that channel, the way an NPR reporter would say, "We've confirmed this." But then there are also reporters from other news organs, often the ones that are doing the most aggressive reporting. Do they speak for the TV channel? Do they just speak for their paper? They must do something, because they're often retained as contract contributors to the network. And then there are other people who are retained as contract contributors to the network who aren't journalists at all. They're former government officials, prosecutors, former military officers, former members of Congress, former diplomats, former campaign managers and strategists. I should say that I think the former stuff is probably more true of CNN and MSNBC than of Fox, which has a mix of former and future government officials sitting around in all of its discussions. But to me, the blurred lines between reporter, commentator, and player undermine the authority of our journalism and our public discussion of these events and broadcasts. We mix reported, corroborated fact with plausible theories and with partisan judgments and opinions. Why should somebody who's billed as a political analyst be doing a panel with somebody else who's a former national political party chair? To me, there's a difference between people who are actors in our political life and people who observe it and analyze it. At one time, these things made a big difference. In the 1980s, your former honorary Dan Schorr, who might have had something to do with bringing to NPR, Dan was the first journalist hired by Ted Turner, another honorary, I believe, as Turner was about to create what wasn't yet called CNN, but soon would be. So Dan gets hired. Dan, I should say, had some Murrow in his DNA. He had been a young stringer in the Netherlands after the Second World War, and Murrow hired him, and he became a pretty good Moscow correspondent, and the Berlin correspondent, whom I remember as a kid talking about this wall that had gone up, dividing the sectors of Berlin. And then he was a White House correspondent when Richard Nixon was in office, and he was tough. He was very tough on Richard Nixon, so much so that the White House ordered an FBI investigation of him. And when they were called out on this, they had the remarkably implausible explanation that he was being considered for a job. This was the same man, Dan Schorr, who, in reading the enemies list during a Senate Watergate committee hearing, saw his own name on the list. As I mentioned earlier today in another group, Dan, who was, as I say, a tough guy and very funny, years later met Nixon in the 1990s, I think, in Washington. And when he met him on a receiving line or something, he said, Mr. President Dan Schorr. And he said, Dan, damn near hired you. Dan later leaked a copy of the House Intelligence Committee report that disclosed CIA abuses. At one point when he was telling someone at CBS, why do you think it's me? He cast possible blame on a colleague, more or less saying could have been her. That, and I would say also the substance of his leak, led to him being benched by CBS. Oddly, he remained on contract. He even got a raise while there. I realized at one point that Dan had made more money for not working than I had yet to make for working in my life at that time. But working for Turner, he was at one point paired with a partner commentator for either a State of the Union message or maybe it was a convention, I don't know. It was John Connolly. Connolly, for those of you who were too young to remember, had been the conservative Democratic governor of Texas. He'd been in the motorcade the day of JFK's assassination, famously took a bullet, became a Republican, became Richard Nixon's Treasury Secretary, sought the Republican presidential nomination, and I believe broke a record for money spent on fewest votes, most money spent on fewest votes gained in primaries that anybody could ever remember. And Dan said, why am I paired with John Connolly? He said, Dan said, I'm a journalist, news analyst, and he's a politician. And Dan felt he may have famously angered Republicans, including a Republican president, but that didn't make him a Democrat, didn't make him a political activist. That's what reporters, that's what they risk doing. You make people upset. And he should not be cast as a foil to John Connolly or vice versa. They were apples and oranges. So he and Turner parted ways, and fortunately, he came back to NPR. And he stayed there until the weekend before his death at age 94, on the air with Scott Simon on a program that I, in my past life as a manager, had launched. Channel surfing these days, I suspect that Dan's concerns, how can you put me, I'm a journalist, on with these guys, would be regarded as somewhat quaint. Panels of guests hold forth, usually about Donald Trump, and they include people with every sort of interest, including journalistic interests, but it's only one of several. I find a lot of what I see today as like having my living room filled with the best informed friends you could ever ask for, and they're having conversations about the events of the day, but whether these discussions, these many conversations, actually clarify what's established fact, what's theory, what's the conclusion of a reporter, what's the conclusion of somebody who's talking with people in the know, what's the thinking of somebody who reads the papers the way I do, but reads it cleverly and smartly. I find it kind of confusing. But it's human. It's more human than it used to be. Another big humanizing trend has been that journalists have emotions on television. And when I watch and hear Murrow telling me about Senator McCarthy, I don't hear him emoting a lot. I hear him speaking to me the way the CFO would tell me, our company's books are a lot worse than we thought. Or it's the doctor telling me, I've looked, here are the x-rays, surgery is really advisable. Or the judge telling me, you're getting 2 years because you didn't listen to what the CFO told you when you did that. He's an authority figure, he's a professional, his emotions are kept carefully in check, the way I would expect those other professionals to do. More than 20 years ago, a reporter of ours filed a very moving story from the killing fields of Burundi. Everyone, or not everyone, but many remember the genocide in Rwanda, but a year or so before that, there was similar mass murder and mayhem in neighboring Burundi that also involved Hutus and Tutsis. And our reporter, standing in the field of remains of the victims of this horrible violence, described it to us very, very vividly, and cried, and really had difficulty holding it together and broke down. And people in the audience were very much impressed by what had happened, And some people compared it to Murrow's reporting from the concentration camp at Buchenwald when he covered its liberation, which I also went back to listen to, because what I heard in his report from Buchenwald was the very opposite of somebody whose emotions came out. I heard somebody who was angry and under complete control. In that radio report, he described the evidence that he'd seen, that clearly many, many people had been murdered here. 500 men and boys were still alive. There had been as many as 60,000. Where are they now? His conclusion was, I pray you to believe what I've said about Buchenwald. I reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words. If I have offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I'm not in the least sorry. It's a stunning piece of work, and in his day, as Americans were first starting to rely on broadcasts rather than broadsheets for news, that chilling, authoritative seriousness of Murrow's was as persuasive as tears or as candid exasperation. Interestingly, younger colleagues of mine, when they heard Murrow and heard our man, didn't hear the difference the way that I did. People had just changed the way they heard conversation, and I think they just saw Murrow's stoicism as a kind of artifact of a different era when people felt they couldn't really express themselves. I've wondered how, say, the McCarthy story would play today if it were actually presented. I could imagine John Oliver or Trevor Noah reading all those clips of Joe McCarthy, who was a kind of funny-looking guy, and then debunking him and having a howling laughing fit over these claims. They were so stupid. That probably wouldn't have persuaded anybody who was tempted to believe McCarthy, but I could imagine. I could imagine a show on, say, on Fox TV, perhaps, where someone would argue the plausibility of McCarthy's arguments against all evidence to the contrary. I could imagine typically a mixed bag of talking heads talking about McCarthy, including somebody who defended McCarthy. That would be seen as necessary balance, perhaps. I suspect that my own beloved NPR would fault Murrow for his stiff approach to storytelling. Pick out not just 6 or 7, pick out the best two, and not just have McCarthy, but let's do a soundy story about the author, the witness whom he badgers, and let's produce it a little bit more and have different perspectives represented. The one thing that I'm sure would happen is that if such a program aired, we would see little bits of it being repeated constantly for 24 hours all over our media. Bite-sized bits, not the whole half hour where we saw this perfectly assembled argument against a demagogue. One thing I cannot imagine is a major network over the air in prime time airing such a potentially explosive broadcast, not presenting what someone has to say about a prominent politician, but what the network's top journalist has to say with all the authority of the network behind him. There's one other odd thing I just wanted to add about my sense of early television as it was related to me by a man I met when he served on NPR's board of directors, which to me gave some context to how remarkable Murrow's career in early television was. The man in question was named Reuven Frank. He'd been president of NBC News. He was a great guy, and he was on our board. And he told me the following story, that back in around 1950-51, something like that, Reuven was producing what passed for NBC News' nightly news show, the Camel News Caravan. It's called the Camel News Caravan because it was sponsored by Camel cigarettes. And in fact, at the end of the week, I believe it was, the anchor, John Cameron Swayze, would announce which veterans hospital in the country would receive a shipment of cartons of Camel cigarettes for the hospital patients. It was considered a perfectly wonderful thing to do for them in those days. Brown and Williamson cigarettes, Brown and Williamson Tobacco, excuse me, which sponsored it, placed two conditions on what could not be shown on NBC's news show. One was a live camel, the actual animal. They did not want anyone to be confused by this potentially ugly, snarling, dirty animal with the healthful and artful, stylized logo that they sold their cigarettes with. And the second thing you couldn't show, this is a major network news program we're talking about here. The other thing you couldn't show was anybody smoking anything but a cigarette. Didn't have to be a camel. Nobody could see in the picture what, but you couldn't show anyone smoking a pipe or a cigar. And in those days, and this was to me the most telling fact of what Reuven described to me, the city, I think in North Carolina, where Brannon Williamson was based, didn't yet have television. So the company executives couldn't actually watch the program that they were sponsoring. And so Reuven and another guy would fly down with kinescopes, with films of the program, and show the sponsor, the executive in charge of this account, what his program had on the air, the Camel News Caravan. And on one such visit, Reuven told me that he decided to plead for one exception to the what you show people smoking rule. He said, Winston Churchill is the most famous man in the world, and he is never seen without a cigar, clenched in his teeth. And with this rule, we can never show Winston Churchill. And our whole thing is we have news footage. This is like newsreels on television. So can we just have a, one pass to be able to show Churchill, even if he is smoking a cigar? And he said the tobacco company executive said, he thought, and he said, okay, you can do that. To which Reuven said, what about Groucho Marx? To which he said, the tobacco executive said, Frank, don't push it. And I was struck by the fact that what Reuven reminded me of was that television around 1950 and the early 50s was growing very rapidly, but it was still a medium that was playing to early adapters, to people in big cities, to people who were typically well-to-do. The country still had a huge rural population in the 50s. We were still shifting towards cities in those days. But many places didn't have television yet, and so they weren't the people that the Reuven Franks, the John Cameron Swayzes, the Edward R. Murrows were talking to. This was also called the golden age of TV television drama, when the best actors on Broadway would appear in live shows on television, very often by our best playwrights and very often about challenging contemporary themes. And they were performing for the kind of audience that would go see them on Broadway. They were performing for these people who had television sets in the early 1950s, when that was not the norm, and when lots of people in other parts of the country couldn't see them. You could say that television was being produced in those days by and for educated, well-to-do urban people. Part of what happened to CBS News in the years after Murrow's greatest successes, in the years when my professor Fred Friendly quit, was that a new president of CBS took the network toward bigger audiences that were by definition less educated, more rural, more representative of the country as a whole, less elite in today's terms. And this was epitomized always by the Beverly Hillbillies, when people criticized CBS for its new values of what the American people should be seeing in the way of drama. It was the television that led John F. Kennedy's FCC Commissioner Newton Minow to call American television a vast wasteland and propose public broadcasting. Fred Friendly went to Columbia University to teach when the network wouldn't put on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings into Vietnam. It insisted instead on an I Love Lucy rerun, which it was noted had already rerun, I believe, more than once. So it seems to me that in those great early days of television, a lot of people were doing what I think some of us were doing at NPR when I first went there, was producing stuff that we would listen to. They were producing shows they would watch. And that served as good a measure, as good a guarantee of quality as an audience research study which showed whom you should be pointing your program to and how you'd win over the ideal demographic. And as television became a central medium in our country, I think those people began to not do the very work that they would demand of the network had they been the audience. I come away with all this in my season of retrospection feeling that what I found at NPR, where a place I thought I would have to spend 2 years before I could work my way back to civilization in New York City, what I found there was a lot of young people, my age, my generation, making radio journalism the way we had been taught at universities, the way we'd effectively been taught by the values of Edward R. Murrow. And it seems to me that in today's broadcast news environment, especially now with this great profusion of podcasts in the radio or audio field, it seems to me that unlike 1968 when I first got into this, the person who is really interested in the news and curious and feels ill-served by the handiest news outlets has the richest variety of interesting, high-pegged, well-crafted, wise writing and listening and on YouTube viewing that you can possibly connect with. If you don't like your American coverage, you could read British newspapers. You can watch foreign news telecasts. And the kind of read-in that I used to have to do for a story or a big interview, which our research library would prepare me with endless clips that, and public documents that the listener couldn't find. I mean, I was privileged to be in this position to report on this now because I knew so much. Everyone can have on Google in a minute today. It's that's changed radically, and I feel in a way that my generation met a challenge to create a better kind of probing, smart journalism that would explain things and that would be human, maybe too human, and that would, provide something on the airwaves that would be for curious grown-ups. The challenge for the next generation, and I think if I were young now, I hope I would take it up, is I think trying to reach people who aren't so curious, and trying to reach people who may not be prepared by their education to take on stories about complex economic policy changes or foreign conflicts. News that's accessible, that's serious, that makes clear who's the reporter, who's the commentator, what's the difference between fact and opinion. And I'm hopeful that there are enough people who are fed up enough with the current situation we're in to bring, perhaps in some new media, perhaps centered on digital media, a new idealism that addresses people who may feel left out in a society that has done very well by the very educated and the very well-to-do, and who may not feel very well served by their media. If we don't reestablish a journalism that's credible, whether or not you agree with or even know the opinions of the reporters who are talking to you, if we don't, then I think, as Murrow quoted Shakespeare to Senator McCarthy, the fault will lie not in our stars, not even in our media stars, but in ourselves. So thank you for your attention for this wonderful prize, and I welcome your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, Bruce. Thank you very much. Hi.
Robert, thank you very much. Sure enjoyed that. I told Robert today at the President's house, I'm not much of a groupie, but if I were, I wanted to be a rock star in college. I probably shouldn't tell you that, but Bruce Springsteen, U2, or Robert Siegel. Those are my. Those are my.
It's that Simpsons thing that gets you.
Well, no, it's really not actually. It's the 30-plus years I've been listening to broadcast. It's been incredibly meaningful to me. I have some questions I'm going to ask. We're also going to take questions from the audience as well. Where the time. In fact, I'm going to take my watch off. I know those chairs are not the most comfortable, but we have a rare opportunity to hear from someone who is incredibly important in journalism. Robert, I want to start with this question. When we talked at dinner last night, I mentioned I met with David Rhodes, the head of CBS News, last month in New York. And I was asking him about the skills we teach students. We have a challenge because we only have students for so many classes, and the fundamental skill that every communication student needs, certainly every journalist needs, is writing skills. And of course, the new skills we're building on is all the digital communication technology skills. And so I was asking him about the balance of skills he's looking for in the students he hires, and what was his experience, basically, looking for ideas about ways in which we can tailor our curriculum in order to teach more effective students. As our conversation progressed, and it was actually a really meaty conversation, much more than just a meet and greet, he began really kind of expressing frustration with digital communication technology. And at one point, he just looked at me straight up, and I guess this isn't really new digital communication technology, but he said, "Bruce, we don't hire people to answer email." So, and he expressed frustration with some of his reporters. He said, I'll ask somebody, "Did you talk to that person?" And they'll say, "Yeah, I texted him." And they'll say, "No, did you talk to that person?" "Well, I emailed and didn't get back to me." And so this notion of the role of digital communication technology or communication technology, in his mind, it was almost a barrier to effective communication rather than a conduit to effective communication. I'm wondering, what's your opinion of digital communication technology in your experience? Has it hurt or helped journalism, or both? Is it somewhere in between?
50 years ago, I didn't think I'd end up being the Luddite that I am in my dotage.
Yes,
I'm not a huge fan of social media. And I do think that the problem you've mentioned, which is the young person who feels that he's tried to get an answer because he emailed or he texted.
Right.
"We didn't get it, so be it." Or "I emailed and texted, here's what we have." That's a problem. That's a problem because when we have our people making those contacts, very often the question we ask is, please find somebody who'll be able to talk to us about this.
Yes.
And if you see how they text, you don't know how they're going to be on the air. Mm-hmm. So the report back we get from a young journalist on All Things Considered, we used to get, so I have to remember that I'm retired, that we used to get on All Things Considered, the report back was not just, "This woman's terrific. She served she was on the staff of the committee that covers this and investigated it. She actually teaches a course about this. But I can't hear that well on the phone. I think she has a really serious lisp, and she may be hard to follow on." I mean, part of the report is, what does she sound like on the air? What does she sound like on the air? So texting and emailing and all that, these are assists. They help us do things faster, but it doesn't substitute for a conversation, a face-to-face conversation. At some point you have to, journalists have to be able to, walk out among people and interrupt them and ask them questions, and you shouldn't be such a shy person that you hide behind digital communications at that moment.
Very good. What advice would you give students today interested in journalism?
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the first advice I would give is, at the moment when I decided that I would want to work in this, the place that provided me a home for 40 years didn't exist yet. And I remember once, I think for journalism school, I wrote in, they asked you, "What do you want to be doing in 10 years? And I think I actually said at some point, I would want to be anchoring a national radio program at a quality news radio network that actually had longer pieces than just 1 minute. And writing that, I had no right to write that because it didn't exist. Mm-hmm. But very often, if you're now in college, the media is always changing. It's a myth that there was a way it used to be, and it was that way for a long time. That's just what people of a certain age remember as it being when they were coming of age. So it's always changing. Afternoon newspapers are there 1 year and they're failing in the next decade. Radio is big and then it's small again. Television is big and it gets so. You can't base what you want to do if you're going into this field on what the landscape of the media is today, mm-hmm. because it's going to change. Right. It'll be different.
Very good. Very good. One of the things that's impressed me as we've talked, and if you're a regular listener of National Public Radio, you'll hear reports, or I've heard in the past anyway, reports from Robert Siegel, everything from Yankees baseball. I was kind of guessing you're a Yankees fan, maybe.
I lost the faith a few years ago. I was a devout Yankees fan from the age of 5, and somewhere around A-Rod and Roger Clemens, I lost it.
Okay.
But that's right. Go ahead.
steroid era, perhaps.
I'll do my best to like the Washington
Okay.
Nationals.
Well,
this
there
year.
we go. All right. Well, anyway, from Yankees baseball to issues of international relations, and I
Yes.
was curious, how do you prepare for an interview? I think the work that goes into being a good journalist, a lot of people don't appreciate. A lot of our students, they need education. So talk to us about that process.
Well, typically, when I would leave work on the day before an interview, which was nearly every day, the very bookers whom I've mentioned, who would be calling up people typically, would hand me a stack of paper this big. I liked the paper. I didn't just like the digital copy. And that was my homework. That was my homework and my reading. And it was multiple articles about the person I'd be talking to or the issue that we'd be talking about. And it was notes that had been taken on phone conversations with these people. If all of this, sometimes at night I would write up my questions at home, or if not, I would save it for the morning. And if there were things I didn't understand, or I thought I could ask a better question, I might call up a friend, either a colleague or a friend somewhere else who really knew about that, to ask them, is this a smart question, or is it dumb? So a lot of preparation,
Good. As you think back on your career, is there a story that you're particularly proud of, or a story that you wish you'd covered a bit differently?
Well, the second part, there are many that I wish I'd covered. There are too many for me. Let me tell you about a story that I'm proud of, because it's one that every time I would mention it, some of my colleagues would start laughing at the very name of the story. And I thought it was not only a very good story, it was a story that 60 Minutes did almost, not verbatim, but they did very much the same story a couple of weeks later. And it was the story of people called the chicken catchers. And I'll explain to you who the chicken catchers were. There are men whose job, and it's a really dirty, minimum wage, low-paying job. The job is to go in a truck from a chicken processing company off to the farms that raise chickens. When the chickens are ready to be brought in to be slaughtered, and you work at night for some reason. I think it's just the efficiency of it, but they say the chickens were more docile at night. I don't know. You walk into this chicken house and you grab like 3 chickens in one hand and 2 in the other, and you stick them in a pallet, and the chickens are scratching you and they're peeing on you and you're getting filthy and all this. And then you go to another, it's like 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Then you go to another farm. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. And then the truck gets lost and you end up finally at the chicken plant at 11 o'clock the next day. Maybe it should get there at 9, and all the chickens are unloaded. And these people, this particular job, has a whole history of litigation. Ruth Bader Ginsburg once wrote something about the interesting case of the chicken catchers, because if they are transport workers who work in trucks and go to farms and to processing plants, then they're covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, and they're entitled to things like overtime. If they are farm workers, which is what they are when they get out of the trucks and start grabbing the chickens, then they're not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. The big growers, and some would say the Southern Dixiecrats, way back during the New Deal, blocked application of labor law to farm workers. So what are they? And I got wind from a lawyer of a lawsuit that a lot of these guys were bringing, where they had been laid off by the chicken companies, by the big processing companies. Their foremen had been set up as small business contractors, and the chicken companies had decided that whatever problem, these guys were suing for overtime that they'd been due for years and years, and the chicken companies set up, so what's the problem of your foreman? He's a private business guy, he's a contractor. We don't know, what do we know? It just happens we laid him off and set him up in a little business to be the cutout man. And I covered these people who lived in some of the most appallingly poor conditions on the eastern shore of Maryland, who are part of one of the amazing food revolutions of this country, where on the eastern shore of Maryland, chicken was turned from a very expensive luxury meal, chicken in every pot, a car in every garage, meant the most expensive food you could imagine, into a cheap food that we all have. And they were part of this system, and they were about as abused a group of workers as I had met, and several of them were men. They were mostly African American. The workers in the chicken plants were mostly Central American. And I met a couple of people who were at that turning point where they decided they didn't want their kids to grow up as they lived.
which is a remarkable, moment in people when they just decide, this was okay for me. I've been able to do this, but I don't want this anymore. I want my children to live better than this, and I want to have the money that I'm owed. And they won their case. They won their case. And as I say, maybe because the lawyer knew somebody at 60 Minutes too, or maybe because they listened to us, but we both did very good stories about the chicken catchers, and I've always been very proud of it. Just the name chicken catchers would start a senior editor of mine giggling all the time. And I'd have to say, no, it's actually, I think of it as one of the more serious stories that I've ever done. So.
Very good. Outstanding.
Good.
Okay. Very nice. Good. We hear a lot about citizen journalists these days, and in reality, anybody with a Facebook account and a cell phone can post news, if they will. And we have a lot of bloggers, and in some cases, they've been remarkably successful at attracting audiences, in some cases requiring denials from presidential candidates at that level of effectiveness. I'm wondering, are you concerned by this practice of citizen journalism? Does it denigrate journalism in your mind?
No, it doesn't denigrate journalism. I mean, there is, a citizen journalist, whatever that is at best a second cousin from a freelancer, huh?
Right.
Which is a noble trade. I think that, at some point, we become journalists, and we're journalists, and we don't need that kind of modifier. As you say this, I'm thinking of a place where there really is a vital need for citizen journalists. You mentioned, or I think President Schultz mentioned, Chengdu in China,
right.
Sichuan
Yeah,
province,
Sichuan,
where I met a guy who was a Chinese activist webmaster who kept records of people who'd been harmed during the Tiananmen Square massacres, for which he was thrown in prison, and he went back home to Chengdu, and then he got involved documenting land grabs, which are a fascinating form of corruption in China. And he got thrown in prison, he got out. And then when we were there, the earthquake happened. And if you recall, the earthquake struck Sichuan province at about 2:30 in the afternoon. It's at a time when all Chinese school children are back from lunch in school, and many schoolhouses near the epicenter collapsed. And many Chinese in Sichuan province felt it was because they'd been built very shoddily, and they would typically suspect that local officials had, taken bribes, and builders had built the schools badly. This guy, Wang Qi, which also means a vegetable of some kind, but it happens to be, I don't speak Chinese, he began documenting the claims of lawsuits of parents of children and got thrown in jail again. And at last word was very unhealthy. And I realized that he's not a journalist. And in his country, what he's doing is more noble than being a reporter for a party-controlled newspaper.
Right, yes.
But what he's doing is absolutely necessary. And I think it's as vital as the most important work that a journalist is doing, which is finding information, organizing it, and presenting it to the public. So I think in some countries it's really necessary. I think it'll always be somewhat necessary, even in a very sophisticated media environment like ours, although I hope that people don't regard American news media as so broken that they can't count on it for anything. I think it's still a pretty robust sector.
Sure, okay. Let me ask you this then. What essential skill or value does or should a journalist bring? What do they need? What makes a journalist at the end of the day?
Good question. I think a curiosity, a desire to figure out what's really going on, and then relate it to other people if it's important to them. And so I think that it drives my wife nuts. But when I see fire engines going places or police sirens, I don't want to get away from that place.
Yes. You run too.
What's going on?
Yes,
What's going on here?
Sure.
There should be some instinctive curiosity about the things going on around you, and then I think that there should be a willingness. There used to be, the old line was to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Mhm.
Perhaps that's too ideological, but I think that we at least should bring a curiosity and then a skepticism about the explanations we're given for things.
Mm.
So we should be pursuers of information and facts, and also questioners of the stories we're given.
Okay.
So
Good.
skepticism and curiosity.
Okay.
How about that?
Outstanding. All right. We hear a lot about bias and fairness in media, and you mentioned, people perceiving that journalism is potentially broken. What's your perspective on responsibility for bias and fairness? When I was in journalism school, we talked about being unbiased, and really that may not be possible. So then we talked about being fair, basically, and presenting both sides of the story. And then what you end up with occasionally is reporting that takes perhaps a sound argument, and then in the name of fairness or balance, also presents the other side or multiple other sides. Oftentimes they have their specious arguments, or they're lacking in evidence or fact necessarily.
Yeah.
And so what's your opinion of media bias or
well, first, I think, and I think this is what most journalists would say, and I heard Eric Johnson saying it in a workshop today,
Right.
which we all feel, no matter what your own opinions are and what your own preferences are, you go to work, and as I say, like any other professional, you set aside your own personal preferences for the demands of the job.
Mhm.
The job demands that you question and that you write fairly. It's a struggle, and it's a struggle if you only work among people who all agree with each other,
Mhm.
so that you may not notice when you are expressing an opinion.
Sure.
Because everybody has it and thinks it isn't an opinion.
Mhm.
So that's a danger, and it's a good reason for having different kinds of experiences, and also having a strong, frankly, hierarchical structure in a newsroom,
Mhm.
with an editor who's experienced enough to know that you're not getting something right. The point you raise about I think it was Murrow who said that the truth doesn't always lie equidistant
Exactly, that's right.
between two
It's
extremes.
not quite the quote, but yeah, you're exactly
Something
right.
like
that idea, that's right.
And it's
yes.
a very important point, especially as we've gotten it in science reporting,
Right.
where it is true that there are minority views of scientific questions. It is true that there are some scientific theories that are widely held and are then disproved after a while.
Right.
All of that is true. However, that doesn't mean that every widely held scientific finding must be answered by some wingnut who happens to think that the world is flat. I mean,
right.
And this is a very tough issue because people feel that you're being unfair to an opinion because it's a widely held opinion. That when in fact people would say, no, it's not a widely held opinion. It's a widely observed phenomenon by most people. There was a guy who, for years, I think his name was Duisberg, for years, he disputed that the HIV virus caused AIDS, and that the whole theory of the virus was off.
Mhm.
And his view was completely debunked, and yet he maintained a media presence on the fringes of media, even once in one public television show I watched him, who, because he was interesting, he had a different view,
Right,
and he
yes.
told good stories about his experience in Haiti, was given some airing for what I thought were completely ridiculous ideas. Not that I thought, but that virologists and scientists thought
Right,
were
sure.
terribly. So the fear, the danger is that you will impose a false equivalency on arguments that have no scientific basis and
Right.
those that do.
Very good. Okay. I have some questions from the audience I want to get to also, but I want to ask you about this notion of fake news. We have a presidential administration that has really made media an object of derision in some respects, and I don't mean that as a politically biased or unbiased statement. It's just really more of a statement of fact.
Yeah.
I think President Trump has attacked media more than we would ever, any other president, more than we would have anticipated.
Well, let me just say, I think your use of the word derision is correct, because when I think of Nixon's handling of the press, I think that what he actually did, the actions, were actually more harmful than things that Donald Trump has done.
Oh, interesting.
Donald Trump talks a great deal.
Yes.
And he has lowered the level of discourse, and he's introduced a level of schoolyard insult into his discussion of the media. I can't honestly say that what he's really done to the news media is close to what the Nixon White House did to public television, let's say, when it broke up a centralized network and turned it into a thoroughly localized, so that we should, God forbid, we should have a BBC-like structure that
Right.
would be, which actually NPR is. I mean, when I came there, friends said, you know, it's embarrassing, we're so low profile, Nixon forgot to break us up when he destroyed public television, he forgot to destroy us. So those things did much more damage, I think. You know, sicking the FBI on Dan.
Right.
So far, we haven't seen anything like that.
Yeah, that's true.
Now the evening is still young, so we may yet see things. But so far, I think the question is, you know, the damage that can be done through, as you say, derision and treating a relationship between vital institutions of American life, the presidency, the media, and introducing, you know, this discourse of insult to it.
Okay, okay. So this notion of fake news, then, has that harmed journalism in your mind?
Well, no. I mean, we just had this situation where I think one of the big papers, either the Washington Post or the New York Times, was denounced by the White House for the fake news of saying that Trump's White House, Trump's legal team was in disarray. So that was about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. And since that time, you know, they try to hire Joe DeGeneva and his wife, and then decide not to. Dowd leaves the legal team. It's in disarray. I mean, there's no question about it. The other paper reported that he was going to can McMaster as national security advisor. It's like there's nothing, they get along perfectly, and McMaster's fired.
Right,
after that.
right, sure.
So at some level, the accusation of being fake news is, you know, is worthy of, you know, it's easily handled the way Murrow handled McCarthy.
Sure.
When the same things that are called ridiculous happen 2 weeks later.
Right, right.
The oddest thing that's happened, and I think the most dangerous thing that's happened to this fake news thing, is that when you hear people in Libya attack the CNN film of what would amount to a slave market, and when they want to say that that, in fact, real thing is not true, it's wrong, it's fake news. And they've adopted the vocabulary of the president's attack on the American media. And so you'll hear from Philippines, Duterte, the president who has admitted to things that, you know, he's proud of things that are horrible, and when he's criticized, he will use the same vocabulary of fake news, and it may have a worse impact on countries that don't have institutions as strong as ours, and that feel that the United States is not going to criticize them for authoritarian behavior, which is now I don't find that a good thing. If that, it may not happen also, but I think that that the state of Filipino journalism is more damaged by all of that than American journalism is.
Okay, good. So one of the questions from our audience that kind of relates to this notion of fake news is, and partly we've talked about this a bit before, is this idea of getting past the images that politicians portray and this notion of kind of false balance, and how do reporters really get at explaining what candidates are about to the public?
Well, it's for a while there was a movement of civic journalism that said, let's just create a grid of all the issues and you know, check boxes and present the voters with this perfect scorecard of what the candidates stand for, and we'll that's how we'll cover the campaign for this congressional seat in North Carolina, and that'll be a much cleaner way of doing it.
Yes, again, more fair and balanced.
My friend and former co-host Linda Wertheimer, who did a lot more political reporting than I did, had the same gagging response to that as I did, and what I would say is that from having spent even-numbered years off doing political trips, usually in Ohio, I come away with the feeling that people cast their vote. They judge candidates in a couple of ways, and the big question is this the kind of person who's going to be looking out for someone like me?
Sure.
I know that I don't care what the issues are. You know, who knows what's actually going to be an issue in a year? It's not going to be the stuff we're concerned about this September, October. But do I think this person is going to be looking out for someone like me or other people.
Mhm.
And then there's a big question, is the other person worse than this one? Will I do less harm by voting for this person
Right, sure.
than for the other person? And I develop a view of the candidate, I think voters do, through some mix of the issues, the positions they take, their biography, what they've done in the past. Some things that I think we've learned from Donald Trump's success that they may not care as much as nearly every political strategist would have said they do is they don't seem to care that the candidate makes a perfect family photo with their impeccably nuclear family and their traditional values. A lot of voters don't seem to care if the president, the candidate, never goes to church and can't credibly describe anything about his religion in a way that rings true. Maybe some of those things have been greatly overblown in terms of what voters value and how we get to know what candidates are all about. Trump is very interesting in that.
Right, yeah,
in that
absolutely.
sense.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm curious. I won't be a part of the midterm election cycle at NPR or the next presidential race. I'm very curious how people are starting to think about this, and I want to talk with them about what have we learned from this last election cycle, and how we tell people about candidates. It's a very good question. It's one that journalists should be addressing and answering, and I don't have the answers yet.
You've done great so far. All right. So I have two questions about communicating science to the public, and I'm going to combine them essentially and just say, what advice do you have? We talk about issues related to climate change as an example. What advice do you have for scientists trying to communicate to the public?
What advice do I have for
complicated
scientists?
issues, right?
Yeah. I mean, I have to tell you, my instinct reaction is, please don't start every sentence with the word "so." Is my because that is the key identifier of scientists whom we interview on NPR. Every so this or that, so talkers. I think that the skills you have to use when scientists deal with the media are the skills of undergraduate teaching.
Sure.
They're the skills not of the graduate research laboratory.
Right. Yes.
But of talking to relatively open minds who don't know. They're starting cold, and you have to teach. And I think science journalism has been a very important part of NPR. And a very important part of our success, in that it led us into the role of the patient explainer. And let's use any kind of analogy with sound that we can. Let's try to make this complicated idea. Let's unpack it. Let's translate it out of jargons, and let's try to make it accessible to people. And some of the best stuff we've done has been of that kind. And it's then bled over into economics journalism and all kinds of other fields.
Very good.
So I think that the scientist should be prepared for a naive questioner.
Fair enough.
Even if it's a journalist. Yes.
Okay. Very good. Outstanding. Okay, so we're rounding the corner here. We have some questions about retirement. Someone wants to know, what will you miss most about your work now that you've retired?
What I miss most is the company of the people. I remember we once had a guy who used to write commentaries when we had more commentaries on we had commentaries on the program. And for years after he stopped doing the commentaries, he would still come. He'd been a newspaper man who'd been at the Washington Star for some years, but he would come and he'd hang out and he'd be in the show area. And after a while I got it, which was that it was really fun being around this place and being part of this team effort to put a program on every day. And what I missed, there's only one day since my retirement when I read the news, and I wished I could have been on the air that day. But what I miss many days is the terrifically interesting, smart, funny people whom I worked with, who were there, and everybody talking about what we were interested in that day, which was a way of saying, what do we want to have on the program today? And that's what I miss the most. And my wife and my dog are great company, but there's that ready-made community of interesting folks whom I've known for so long, and lots of terrific young people who've been with us for a very short time and who were, kind of family.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
The only day, by the way, I missed was the day of the Russia indictments. I read on my iPhone, I read the indictment. I thought this was like an outline for a novel.
Uh-huh.
I wished I could have been on the air that day. I wished I could have interviewed 6 people about what Mueller had spelled out in that indictment. The rest of it, playmates, pornographic movie stars.
Well, not going to touch that one at all.
Yeah.
So we'll end with this.
Yeah.
How have you adjusted to retirement, and do you have any future plans that involve media journalism?
First of all, I don't have any future plans, and I've just been enjoying this idea of not having plans. I have a calendar full of places I have to go over the next couple of months, but no big plans. I haven't yet really figured out if I'm supposed to do something now. I mean, why? Why should I?
You are. Yeah.
Nearly anything I'm going to do is going to be less satisfying than the wonderful job that I did, very fortunately, for many years. I told this to Terry Gross, whom I've known for many years, that I recently interviewed a woman who'd written a book about the making of the movie The Graduate. The Graduate came out 50 years ago, last December, I think, so it was put out then, and I remembered taking a girlfriend to see it. It was a big deal, this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, this recent college graduate is being asked by everyone what he's going to do. What are you going to do? And I realized that I, with my retirement having been announced, was reliving this experience 50 years later, that everyone was asking me, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And it seemed to nobody, it didn't seem sensible, or maybe it was insulting to suggest nothing would be the answer. But anyway, I was always being asked this, and so Terry asked me, did somebody say plastics to you? And I said, no, they keep on saying a word that sounds a little bit, they say podcasts. And so every week or so, somebody suggests, you should be doing a podcast about this. And my answer is, well, I don't know, maybe in the summer I'll figure out if I want to.
All right.
Right now, I'm enjoying life without deadlines and without assignments. So
could just go to a baseball game.
I bought a piece of, just 10 games of a pair of season tickets, and
very good.
Enjoy the Nats this year.
Outstanding.
My newfound like in baseball. Yeah.
We'll look for some social media from you about the Nats then.
Okay.
Outstanding. Well, we've had a great evening tonight. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bruce. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. And so I'm just going to say one last quick thing. My joke about you don't look like what I thought you would look like. I always like to say that having never been to Pullman, Washington before, but having been to many groups where people know public radio, I know what you look like. You're civic-minded people, and a great many of you do something which is quite remarkable. You pay for radio programs that you could have for free. And on that ridiculous business plan, the very wonderful little radio network I went to work for many years ago has thrived and grown a great deal. So thank you very much for your support of public radio.
All right, we have one more request, Robert. This is from the audience. We have a tradition here. Our mayor of Pullman is also the voice of the Cougs broadcasting here for many, many years. And when the Cougars make a first down, he says, and that's another Cougar first down. So someone has requested that you end the evening with, and that's another Cougar first down in that famous voice.
And that's another Cougar first down.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.